This podcast contains descriptions of death and violence that some listeners may find upsetting.
Hello, and welcome to this special edition of the 6 o'clock knock, the true crime podcast presented by me, Simon Ford.
And me, Jacques Morel. I'm a retired major crime detective, and now, with my friend and sparring partner, we reinvestigate historic homicides on our quest to find the truth.
Whatever that may be. It was announced this morning that Peter Sutcliffe, alias the Yorkshire Ripper, Britain's most prolific serial killer, had died in jail. Sutcliffe was 74. He'd been serving a whole life prison sentence for the savage murders of 13 women in and around the cities of Leeds, Bradford and Manchester in the 1970s.
Sutcliffe had a deep-seated hatred of women. He claimed that God told him to rid the streets of sex workers. In fact, his crimes were indiscriminate. His MO, his modus operandi, was the same though. Blows to the head with a hammer, followed by frenzied stabbing. One case involved strangulation.
Between 1975 and 1980, the Yorkshire Ripper, as he was styled by the media, inflicted a reign of terror on northern England. For years, women were afraid to go out alone after dark. Proposals for a women-only curfew sparked outrage, coupled with the failure of the police to catch the killer.
That failure is the subject of 2 future episodes of the 6 o'clock knock. Why was Sutcliffe allowed to terrorise and butcher women in the dead of night with impunity?
How did Sutcliffe escape a police dragnet that involved hundreds of officers, cost millions of pounds of public money, and generated so much paperwork a police station had to be reinforced to stop it collapsing under the weight?
It's all the more incredible when you learn that, in that terrible period, Sutcliffe was questioned an astonishing 9 times by detectives. We've also spoken to a senior police officer who was a rookie when the Yorkshire Ripper claimed his first victim.
Bob Taylor was a detective constable and later a detective sergeant in the Ripper incident room. He retired a few years ago as Detective Chief Superintendent of West Yorkshire Police. In the 70s, Taylor could only watch as the then Assistant Chief Constable George Oldfield, a hard-drinking, hard-bitten and hard-biting Yorkshireman, botched, bungled and bullied his way through the biggest manhunt in British history. Bob Taylor says Oldfield's handling of the Ripper investigation was disastrous from beginning to end.
I think what I learnt from working on the cases that George Oldfield was in charge of was of how not to do it. There was no room for anybody to make suggestions from the lower ranks. And there were several good suggestions. I mean, one of the detectives who I worked with, Detective Constable, he said, why don't they look at what was known as the Canadian system, which was a geographical plotting system. The principle behind it was that the offender would travel to avoid detection. So the first attacks were more likely to be close to home. The other thing about working on the Ripper case is they couldn't get their head around the fact that some of the victims could have survived. And of course, not recognising that, there was a massive loss of evidence. One of the victims in Chapeltown, she did the artist's impression of Dave. He used the name Dave, and she was just dismissed. And that was probably the closest picture that anybody produced of Sutcliffe. When another colleague went and said, I used to be a heavy goods vehicle driver. Josephine Whittaker, which is Savile Park, the footprints, one of the boots showed heavy wear. And they said, that's what my boots were like as a heavy goods vehicle driver. One boot used to wear out before the other. And we just told, get on with your work. And what was our work? Our work was eliminating people on criteria that wasn't correct.
Incredible. There were survivors who could have identified Sutcliffe, but their evidence was brushed aside.
Anna Rajolski, Olive Smelt, Tracy Brown. She was a kid of 14 when Sutcliffe smashed her skull and left her for dead in a country lane. Marcella Claxton, dismissed because of her race and her so-called reputation. Maureen Long, Marilyn Moore.
And that business with the boot impression at one of the crime scenes? There's no way when I investigated homicides that kind of forensic evidence would have been overlooked. But of course, my police career came after the Yorkshire Ripper. In fact, the mistakes they made changed the way we investigate murder in Britain.
Indeed. That's what we do on the 6 o'clock knock. We take your powers of investigation, Jack, wave the evidence under my journalist's nose, and go after the stories behind the headlines.
And wherever you are in the world, there will be lots of headlines about Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper. He remains, in death, Britain's most prolific serial killer.
So, if you haven't already, please do subscribe to the 6 o'clock knock. The first part of our series about the hunt for the Yorkshire Ripper, how it shaped police procedure and shifted society's perspective in so many ways, is coming tomorrow. In the meantime, thank you for your company, stay safe, and stand by for that next revelatory episode of the 6 o'clock knock.
The 6 o'clock knock is presented by Simon Ford and Jack Morrell and produced by Paul Bradshaw and is available on every major listening app. Please help us spread the word by giving us a 5-star review and telling your friends to subscribe.